Thanks for joining us today. We have the privilege of speaking with Leo Hollis. He's an urbanist, a historian, and an author. He's written several books, including The Phoenix, Inheritance, and Cities Are Good for You. We'll be speaking with Leo about the history of London, St. Paul's Cathedral, and the future of what cities look like. We hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, Leo, thank you so much for joining us today. We're looking forward to a really insightful and good conversation with you. Can we start off and tell us a little bit about your background, the books you've authored, and your current interests?
Thank you. I would say it's an odd title, but I would say that I'm not an architect, nor am I even possibly a sort of architectural historian. I'm an urbanist, which is to say that I spend most of my time thinking about cities. And obviously, the question of architecture and the built environment is absolutely hardwired into that kind of sort of question. So how did I get to that? Because it's not necessarily something which is a sort of straightforward job, if you like. I think I became fascinated with cities very early on, partly because as a 10-year-old, my parents decided to move out of London into the countryside. And I think I spent my teenage years desperately pining to return to the city. I never felt at home in the rural surroundings. So getting back to the city and sort of, in some ways, sort of idolizing what the city was in some ways the start of that journey. I come from quite a sort of bookish family, although there are designers. My mother was a landscape designer. My brother is an architect. But I've always sort of lived my life around books. But the thing that really got me thinking about the sort of city is actually walking. One of the things that I do almost as a kind of sort of practice is walking around sort of the city. In particular, this started off with London, and just finding my way around the city and learning how it works. And that combined with, sort of going to the archives and going to the library, really is where I think sort of urbanism comes together. It's a lived experience as well as a sort of a sort of intellectual practice. And the strange thing about being in London, and particularly if one is always crossing the city, and at one point I was working in the West End, living in the East End, I would walk across the city every morning to go to work, and it would be about a 45-minute walk or so. And I would always walk past St. Paul's Cathedral, and St. Paul's Cathedral is the one building you can almost sort of see from any other point in the city. So it became this kind of compass and this idea of London. And there came a moment just when I felt, what's the story behind this place, and how does it connect with the rest of the city around it? And so my first book was thinking about a very important moment in London's history, which is the Great Fire of London, mid-17th century. And I would argue that through a series of calamities, in some ways, sort of, a revolution, a fire, a plague, another revolution, London was transformed and became the first modern city. And I needed to unpack that in some way. And going back to St. Paul's Cathedral was always, in some ways, the touchstone in which to tell that story. And so, in some ways, architecture came into the flow. It wasn't there from the outset. It was always part of the mix of trying to tell the story of a city. And I've always been sort of fascinated in architecture. And my second book dug into that even more. So it was a history of London through 12 buildings called the Stones of London. So going right from the origins to the present day, and choosing iconic buildings of a particular moment as a way to tell the story of that sequence of history, that chapter of urban sort of life. And buildings are quite good because they're often quite silent, although they are incredibly loud and big and in front of you. But they are very good at telling you stories, and they are very good to be used as the kind of the sort of the sandpit of storytelling as well, because a building is not just a building, obviously, and I'm sure that's something that we're going to go unpack later on. And how we talk about stories tells such an important story about who we are. So in some ways, have been and continue to have unfinished business with London and the history of London. But I've also had this kind of other strain, which is thinking about what a city is, and how it works and whether it is working, if you like. Another book of mine was a book called Cities Are Good For You, which came out around that moment when people were talking about the future of cities. It was that particular moment when, in some ways, the world was suddenly became urban. But we got to that moment in 2007 when the world became 50% urban for the very first time in our history. And so a lot of people were wondering, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? What can we do? And when we were thinking about some climate change, is the city a good or a bad place in order to mitigate or to sort of face up to the challenges of the next sort of century? And that's been something that I've continued to do. And in my current work, I'm sort of looking at sort of city building in the 21st century. So there is a historic element. There is a kind of, a present element, trying to get to the idea of what cities, buildings, architecture, what this thing we do is, and how we live in them, and how the relationship between flesh and stone, between sort of space and community, as well as what are we going to do in order to make sure that we survive the rest of this century.
And where do your current interests lie, Leo?
My current interests, I will always toggle between the past and the sort of future, but I'm very much thinking about the current experiments in city building that I'm observing around the world. There are lots of new ideas about what a city is, which are emerging, I think, in unexpected places, often in the middle of a desert. There's also a number of ideas that are coming about as a result of increasing network sort of relationships. So how something like a kind of some network city could be developed, and the relationship between technology, the sort of technology of cityness, with sort of society, and how that's in some ways offering a new kind of sort of social contract. So there's lots to be challenged by, to think through. We probably are living at the moment in a moment of city building which is pretty unprecedented. There are more cities being built now from scratch than there has been for a very long time.
That's super interesting. Going back to your point on the history of London and how you kind of think about the city of London, it seems like you think about these or cities in general in almost a narrative form, and the buildings themselves play characters in the story. And I find that super fascinating, and that's kind of how I read your book, The Phoenix, and that's kind of my impression of it is that the buildings are the lens through which you view and are the characters through which you view or understand a story. And to me, that's a much more interesting, complex, rich, and depth way to see and understand a city, deeper way to understand and see a city, as opposed to just viewing buildings as these isolated moments and the history and the dates and these, these isolated instances. I just think the perspective is incredibly interesting, and I find that fascinating. Also, because that's, I feel like in some ways the way when we design buildings, or when our group design buildings, we kind of look at the narrative of somebody's life and what are the events that are going to happen in somebody's life. What are the spaces that they use on a daily basis? And that's how we kind of look at how a home, well, let's say, would be designed as through a narrative of their life. So I find that fascinating.
I mean, it is, and it's a challenge because it goes against quite a lot of what we think, probably as designers, but also kind of as historians or sort of theorists, is that architectural history is very much kind of based around the idea that an architect will draw a building, the building is then built, and then that's the end of the story. The first day that the building opens, that is the last chapter. And that's completely wrong. I mean, I think a building is a really good way of trying to sort of trying to get people to, or trying to see into people's minds in terms of their intentions and their aspirations. And quite often you're looking at a building as a kind of sort of machine, and you take it apart, and it's got bits which explain what the architect is doing. But I think there's a bigger story there, and there was something that I was trying to sort of think through as I was walking around this morning, which is, how many lives does a building have? And I think it probably starts off, its first and second and perhaps even its third life. It sort of starts even before it exists. So it's a time, it's a place, and because we often sort of, as you were sort of saying, we often see a building as isolated, and we sort of say it's the architect, it's the building, and there happens to be some stuff around it. But that's not how one actually experiences a building. That's not how one lives around a city either. So context is absolutely everything. And architectural historians are very bad at thinking about the spaces and the lives between buildings. And that's actually where society is. That's where the social is. That's what's so sort of fascinating. It's in those places which the architectural historian often overlooks is where the most interesting things are happening.
So a large amount of your work is about London, and obviously you're a citizen of London. You lived there your entire life, yes, or is that? And then you moved out to the country.
More or less, yes.
More or less. Can you give us a brief overview of St. Paul's and its place within London's history?
Yeah, of course. I mean, London's history sort of goes back to obviously the arrival of the Romans. There wasn't really anything before the Romans sort of came to London, and they built a temple on top of one of the two hills on the northern shores of the Thames. A number of years later, so in the 7th century, a small chapel was built here, and then this slowly grew out to be, in some ways, the parish church of the city. So London's quite complicated, and I'm not too sure how much we want to sort of necessarily unpack that. In that there is the City of London, which is the city which is within the city walls, and that's a capital C city. And then there is London, which is everything outside it. So St. Paul's has always been the parish church of the City of London. It's only later in the sort of 18th and 19th century that it became, in some ways, the sort of the cathedral for the whole of London, and then in some ways it's like the sort of the whole of England. So it's a principal church within the capital, and as the capital grew, so did the sort of the power of the cathedral. And there were always improvements done until the Reformation, really, where it went from being obviously a Catholic cathedral, a Gothic Catholic cathedral with a big spire, to a Protestant church, and it was left to decline. So it had somewhat in some ways it was on its uppers. The spire had collapsed. There had been fires. It was not really being used as a church anymore. It was a kind of a sort of meeting place in the middle of the city, but where occasionally there were sort of religious services. Actually, all of the important religious ceremonies happened outside the cathedral. And so this is where the very famous English poet John Donne would, in some ways, do all his sermons, was actually outside in the grounds of the cathedral, but not within the nave itself. There was an attempt in the 17th century to revive it, and the great, in some ways, the first British architect, a man called Inigo Jones, had started work on improving and I suppose, cleaning up the cathedral. But then suddenly in the 1640s, there was the beginning of the English Civil War. And this was a political war. It was a religious war. It was a war between various different parts of the country as well. And so London was right at the heart of this kind of sort of tumult. And throughout the Civil War, which went on more or less for sort of about 20 years, St. Paul's was left to completely decay. So when you get the return of the monarchy in 1660, he sees the decay of the cathedral as a kind of personal affront. So this was his church, and he wanted to improve it. And just as he was starting to think about how to improve it, there was the Great Fire of London in September 1666. And this basically wiped out the whole of the central part of the city of London, including the cathedral. And so, in some ways, people had to sort of start again. And my story in The Phoenix is how you get sort of philosophy, politics, economics, the origins of empire, theology. It all comes to play in the reconstruction of St. Paul's Cathedral, and in particular, its architect, who was a man called Sir Christopher Wren, who, in some ways, is seen to be responsible for the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire. I slightly unpack that and sort of say he's not as responsible as many people think, but he's undoubtedly responsible for St. Paul's Cathedral. And his attempt of recreating and rethinking what a cathedral should be at that particular moment in history and in that particular moment of modernity, I think is a really, really interesting way of reflecting and thinking about urbanism, about politics, about philosophy, about engineering, about science. And so you sort of see this building, which looks like a sort of a piece of heritage now. It's a historical monument, but actually it was so much more active in its time when it was being built that you can draw these different stories out of it.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Christopher Wren and his affiliation with the cathedral, his role in the rebuilding of St. Paul's?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Wren is a fascinating character. He's in some ways part of the sort of first generations of what one could call sort of British architecture. So if you think that in the previous generation, there had been one very significant architect, Inigo Jones, who I mentioned earlier. Inigo Jones had gone to Italy. He had traveled around Vicenza and seen the work of Palladio, who was one of the great architects of that region. And he came back and he sort of said, okay, I'm going to be the very first architect and I'm going to build modern architecture. And he started with 4 or 5 buildings around London. And this transformed what architecture was. It gave a profession to what was beforehand an amateur pursuit. It gave a sort of sense of geometry, that there was a discipline, that there was in some ways a sort of code. There was a way of building which was brand new. Wren inherited this from Inigo Jones, but he also brought something else to it, because before he was an architect, Wren was in fact the most important kind of sort of scientist of his generation. He had spent quite a lot of time during the Civil War in Oxford, in some ways being part of a community of new thinkers who call themselves the natural philosophers. And what they were doing was they were adopting the ideas of Francis Bacon, as well as new ideas coming from sort of from Europe, whether that was Galileo or Descartes, and they were formulating what basically could be called modern science, sort of empiricism. And as he was one of the founding members also of the Royal Society. So as a mathematician, as a puzzle solver, as an astronomer, Wren had this brilliantly sort of scientific mind. And he combined it with this pursuit of architecture. He decided that he would take that mathematics and he would turn it into solid stone. He also came from a leading Anglican family. So they were quite sort of powerful in the church. So he also had this sort of religious thread running through him. And you can see that in the way that he kind of recreates and sort of thinks through some of the problems of St. Paul's Cathedral. So I sort of see the cathedral itself as a solution to a number of different problems. And the genius of Wren is he was able to combine all those different elements into one magnificent whole. But if you look at each of those individual problems, you could kind of admire him even more because each one was so complicated and brings out a different part of his personality, whether that's to do with design, whether that was to do with engineering, and, you know, holding that building up. I mean, the stories about, you know, how he was able to do the mathematics to hold that building up are just wonderful. And also, you know, dealing with problems. You know, it cost a lot of money, and there wasn't a lot of money about. There's, you know, the one reason why the cathedral has a particular kind of sort of design on the front, so on the west front, is not because of Wren's design, but because he had to react to a problem in the quarry. And so as a result, you know, he's always sort of changing his designs. He's always accommodating different parts. So unlike most architectural history, where you look at the final designs on the paper, on the renders, and then the building looks exactly like it, Wren's final cathedral looks nothing like his original plans for it. He's always solving problems, and it took 40 years. So even within the time that it took for the building to sort of grow, you had two kings, a revolution. No, you had four kings and a revolution. So, you know, time changed, and he still was able to create a building that was flexible enough to reflect back to the city what it needed. He did die, and on his deathbed, he said, I should never have wasted my time with such, you know, he should have always sort of stuck with mathematics and never have spent his time in architecture. But I think what I admire about him is not his, can I say it, his Howard Rorke-ness. He is the opposite of Howard Rorke in The Fountainhead. Because you know, Rourke refuses for his building to ever change. Wren was totally the opposite of that.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It's like he's adaptable, he's understanding, and that's maybe the genius behind him. Is he's confronted with all these problems and still finds solutions to kind of bring together the best possible solution available, as opposed to this kind of ardent inflexibility. Like you may see, you know, I think a fair amount of architects today, you know, take on that position. But
yeah, I think it reflects on him as a person and his adaptability. But I think there's also what he was also trying to do as he was starting to develop his first plans for St. Paul's, and I think this is kind of sort of credit to him and to his friends who he was all, you know, those sort of early members of the Royal Society. Is, you know, you think that they were sort of solely focused in scientific matters, but they were also trying to think through what English culture was, or British architecture was. Beforehand, you know, everything had been sort of handmade by craftsmen, and, you know, it was some of it was impressive and some of it was very beautiful. But after the sort of Civil War, and after, as London was becoming this sort of first modern city, what does that cityness look like? You know, how do you create a legible modernity through design? And that can be width of the street, it can be materials, so using brick and stone rather than wood and thatch. But it's also thinking about how do you take stuff like Dutch architecture or German architecture or Italian and French and make it English. And I think in some ways the sort of genius of English architecture is it takes all of those elements and combines it and tries to make something that is utterly brand new out of it. And so you can sort of see that it's got all those things. You can sort of see it's got a bit of something from Paris and a bit of something from Rome, and it's got, you know, perhaps a Dutch spire to it. And it's also sort of goes back and looks at the ancient classical texts as well. But it makes it thoroughly modern, and it makes it thoroughly national, I think. And that is also something that is deeply, I think, sort of sometimes you don't see that, but it's really interesting for good or bad. I mean, you know, sort of you know, perhaps this is a heritage that we are stuck with and we need to sort of get rid of. But at that time, you can sort of see they're sort of saying, what does modernity look like?
I think that's a great segue into my next question would be to tell us about a little bit about London's transition out of the medieval and into the modern. You know, we've kind of talked about that, but what does that look like in terms of the city design and the setup of the social, economical, and political kind of stage?
I think there were things that were occurring, as it were, sort of during that period. Anyway, you know, this was the 17th century, so I mean, it was an era of extraordinary sort of transition. The first half of the century had seen the most horrific wars throughout Europe, and that in some ways is what finally arrived in England during the sort of Civil War. You see a transformation in sort of science and intellectual thinking and philosophy. I think you also sort of see the beginnings of empire and also all the horrors that come with that. The places like London and Antwerp and Paris were becoming rich on the goods that they had taken from far-flung new colonies, and that was going to have a very dramatic effect in not only just sort of transforming those cities, but sort of creating these sort of global sort of networks. But what happened specifically in London, I think, during the Civil War, I would say that the first thing that happens with something which is as traumatic as that is there is a rupture with the past. And then modernity is quite interesting in the way that it seeks its identity in the future. It projects itself into the future. It can no longer, in the same way that the sort of medieval society, go back and rest on authority and, you know, the sort of past. So when they were thinking about rebuilding London out of the ashes of the fire, they had to project the city into the future rather than just rebuilding the past. And the way that they did this, I think, was both in design, but also in terms of kind of law and practice. So the city became a human body, if you like. It became a network through which money and bodies and goods had to flow. And the flow of these goods was going to become essential to what makes a city run. And that was something that was completely new. So that had an implication on not just on making sure that the sort of carts and horses were able to move up and down the street in a sort of easy fashion, or that people were actually able to walk up and down and go about their business. But it also sort of started to feed into ideas of banking and how do you get money from one place to another. And that's quite easy across a city. But at this moment, you're also thinking, how do you get money across oceans, across channels? And so you start seeing banking occurring exactly the same time as all of these new innovations in architecture. And they are one and the same. So things like the leasehold and the mortgage and the way that you build a house, these were all transforming as a result of this particular moment. And you wouldn't have suburbia without these changes in manufacturing and in construction. And so London started to grow as a result of all of this sort of innovation. And it started to grow with a very particular profit-driven sort of mechanism. You know, the beautiful London streets that we see, the archetypal Georgian terraces, they very much were a design, an architecture, a kind of formula, almost an architectural formula that was developed during this period in the aftermath of the Great Fire. Um, so you can sort of see this modernity sort of coming about, not just in the way things looked, but in the way that people acted as well. And so there was, you see a sort of a rise in things like luxury goods. This was incredibly important. If you're buying one of these new suburban houses and you're buying it with no decorations in it, and you are a new bourgeois who hasn't inherited large amounts of furniture, you need to buy new furniture. You need to buy new goods, which sort of show people your wealth. And one of the key things I think of this time, and this might sound a bit of a digression, but I think it's weirdly sort of central, is exactly as we're talking at this moment. So you have Christopher Wren, who's a wonderful architect. He's also a scientist. One of the key items for a kind of wealthy person to do at this time was a clock. And the clocks that were developed in London during the 1660s and the 1670s were extraordinary because they were the first really accurate pendulum clocks. And keeping time became incredibly important. And by the end of the century, you actually get the very first factories that time people go to work and coming, and what their work hours are. So you start seeing people looking at time in a completely different way, and that is absolutely essential to modernity.
That's fascinating, Leo. Thank you. What values do you feel will be expressed in cities of the future, and what would those look like?
I think that's a wonderful and very deep question. I think what I found when I was researching cities at Good For You, which was probably about 10 years ago now that I sort of started that, I was trying to sort of find some of the key elements of what a sort of city is. And I think the thing that I came out with more than anything else, and I think there are really important things to sort of say about the challenges that we face in terms of urbanism, in terms of sort of globalization, in terms of sort of climate change. But the thing that people don't talk about and don't think about in terms of design often is trust, which is a very difficult thing to get one's head around, because often one thinks trust is purely a kind of sort of binary relationship between two people who are transacting. And obviously that's incredibly important in a city. So somebody like Richard Sennett would sort of say cities were created so that two strangers could meet. And they meet, as it were, on the level, which is actually a way of talking about the City of London. It used to be called on the level, which meant that you met as equals. And that you could trust each other, you could do the deal, and you were sort of, that's what a city was. It was where strangers transacted and then went on with their lives. And also, it's where people rub up against each other, and sort of, it is where people are neighbors and not friends. And so trust is incredibly important in that aspect. So trust strikes me works through cities in a lot of different ways. But the thing that struck me as I was doing my research is the thing that undermines trust more than anything else is inequality, because you start to sort of see barriers between things and places. So thinking about building a city around trust, one has to start thinking about public space. And public space is also one of the most endangered sort of spaces within the sort of city. Not only because we're seeing increasingly the privatization of public space, it's also that public space is becoming, I think, often degraded. So a public space is a place basically where people meet and they treat each other as equals. So one has to sort of ask questions when one is designing public space. Who is this for? And how do you make it inclusive? How do you draw people into this space? Because the only way that we're ever going to learn to be citizens is by coming face to face with things that one, doesn't see on a daily basis. You only can sort of see the other faces of the sort of city in a public space, because you're not going to do it in your day-to-day. And you're not going to go in some ways out of your way to be confronted by something. So it's about sort of creating these spaces where you meet the unexpected. And it's important in these places that you don't have to agree. You trust each other, but you don't have to agree with each other. Often we're trying to look for some places of I suppose sort of tribes of conciliation, or of unity. But a city is also it's a place where people are allowed to disagree, have different values, but again, you only get to know how to live around those places by experiencing and really living in public spaces. So there was a very interesting sort of experiment that was done about politeness, and it was done in an East End market, so a very working class area of London, where it's known to be one of the most multicultural kind of communities. And in the marketplace, so the place where you sort of go and get your vegetables on a day-to-day sort of basis, was found to be one of the most polite places in England. It wasn't the village with all the bourgeoisie. It wasn't in the sort of the highest enclaves. It was in this working class where people had to come together to buy food, and they learned how to get on with it. I think it doesn't have to be a grand public space, but it needs to be these spaces that we really come to, because we come and sort of find out about the city, and we find out about ourselves, because citizenship is not something that is just sort of given. It's something that we have to nurture. And so going back to that initial idea of trust, that strikes me as the value off which you can sort of hang other sort of values and other practices and other sort of ideas of insight. Another one is thinking about the design of children's play areas, which I find is, so important and is given so little consideration. That it's often seen as the gift of some developer at the end of a project, rather than the thing right at the heart of the development. It's so interesting to sort of think about. If there was a brilliant mayor in actually he was in Bogota in the 1990s, called Enrique Peñalosa, and he said, what if we designed a city around children? Mm-hmm. What would that be like? And you suddenly see that having cars parked along the street suddenly becomes a problem, because they're getting in the way of some kind of sort of community, some kind of sort of safety. So, that actually sort of, you start to think about, okay, let's get the cars off the street. Should we put them in a car park, or should we just provide enough public transport so people don't need to have cars?
Having a 3-year-old myself, I can relate to that idea of maybe how important the design of those social spaces are for the children and how nuanced the interactions are, how important they are for the growth of a child too. And in some sense, you're in your design, or in a design of a space for children, you're setting up kind of not only the psychological health of the social interactions of these kids at that moment, but also for the future too. So, that makes complete sense.
Yeah, and I think it's. I was very, very attracted by this Latin American idea. It actually sort of comes out of Curitiba in Brazil, which is urban acupuncture, which is the age of the master plan has disappeared. But if you did tiny little changes and you actually think quite seriously who they are for,
Yeah.
they can have massive impacts. And that could be a pocket park. It could be, a particular kind of, so for their examples is cable cars, that they use quite a lot. It could be anything, but it's suddenly thinking about those small gestures of generosity. We are binding people together. I mean, in some ways, it's going back to, and so just to make sure that these are not my ideas at all. They're going back to Joe Jacobs, who I think is still the person to go back to on this. It's thinking about that ballet of Hudson Street. The subtle interweaving of everyday lives, not living in each other's pockets, not dependent upon strong ties of sort of friendship or family, but just neighborliness.
As you're saying this, I'm envisioning all of the physical, let's call it manifestations, as an architect would, physical manifestations in a city on how these public spaces would look, what the form of them is. Are they green spaces? Are they not? But you had made an interesting comment when we spoke before, maybe they're actually not physical in the future. Do you have any strong thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, I'm always tempted to sort of suggest to architects that the answer to many of their problems is don't build. The inclination of designers and architects is to do stuff, when sometimes not doing stuff is the right decision. There's always opportunities to adapt. I mean, obviously that's very incredibly important. But also, I'm trying to sort of think of a sort of good example of when not to do things. But obviously we know the dangers of knocking buildings down and sort of just putting new ones up. And sometimes retrofit is so much better than sort of new build, and that is a kind of way of not building. Although it still does take a lot of sort of effort and sort of thinking through. But it's also thinking about how people, let's say, sort of move through the sort of city and thinking about that in different ways, not sort of designing them into sort of funnels where they are sort of instantly going to be sort of crowded and sort of be hassled, but it's sometimes thinking about the serendipitous within the urban.
Yeah, I think it's a maybe a questioning too about the architect's maybe conventional identity as a form giver and somebody who's going to create the space for the people, as opposed to the other way around. Can we look at it to in another light where the people are giving us the information about how they'd like to use a space, a building, and then maybe we're going in and making small interventions, let's call it light modifications to accommodate that natural, more intuitive use. I think that's a much more sensitive approach, and maybe I'm talking directly to myself here.
But I think it's, I mean, it's sort of on a sort of day-to-day sort of level, an architect is hired by a client to make their dreams come true. I mean, that's that. But so I mean, you can't get away from that kind of sort of relationship. I think it's thinking obviously through that, and sort of thinking sort of yes, again, beyond the envelope of the building itself. I mean, and then sort of slowly sort of working through the in some ways, yeah, we're in search of the intangible through the tangible.
I'm curious. This is making me think of a book, The Edifice Complex. Are you familiar? Yeah, it's
very much.
questions about architecture and power, and the association of the architect with that person in power. And yes, it's our livelihood depends upon catering and servicing those people that have access to money to fund the buildings, and that's the nature of our profession. But is there a way to rethink that, or is there a way to I don't know. That's a question that is coming to my mind as I'm currently reading that book.
Yes, I mean, I think it's extremely difficult to sort of make a living and keep an office running if you're not going to be building for somebody. I mean, there are the odd people who are lucky enough to sort of go off and sort of theorize and sort of without building. But no, I mean, I think the majority of design practices are focused in on creating something out of space, out of sort of volumes and light and shade and all of that. But I do think that yes, an architect should always sort of question its relationship to power. I think there's some really good work that's being done on that. I think it's true about you were sort of saying the edifice complex, which is about sort of dictators doing extraordinary things, in some ways sort of Ozymandias or like sort of Augustus, but it's also in true of things like sort of infrastructure. Building a highway in one place and not another is just as much a kind of sort of act of power. So I think an architect should be thinking about sort of power, and particularly when it's thinking about who the space is for. There's one has an extraordinary amount of kind of sort of I suppose power in controlling sort of space, because one understands it and you think spatially. And you're much more sensitive to these questions than most other people. So I think thinking about who is this for, and the power relationships within that space is a rich pursuit.
I think in the past, in history, let's call it the conception of a building was often the maybe impulse or desire of a small group of people, maybe even one person, right? And so you're getting these kind of buildings that come to fruition as a result of a single person. But as time has progressed, it seems to me, and I could be wrong, that and with technology also, that the conception of buildings is becoming democratized. People are having more say maybe in how a building looks, what the space functions for, how parks are situated. That's what it feels like, at least, and maybe I'd like to believe that. But I think that's a product of technology too, and us being able to communicate together, and which makes me feel optimistic about the future.
Yes, I mean, I'd sort of split that down the middle slightly. I would, because I think I don't know what the percentage is, but there's a large number of the city of which basically is built without architects. It comes from essentially an operating system of some variety, whether that's a developer or it's kind of almost like sort of non-architecture in some ways. So the percentage that actually has an architect involved and the sort of in order to create something that is unique is tiny in some ways compared to the whole. If you think of something that somebody like sort of Keller Easterling, I think is really good at writing about, who is at Yale. She very much talks about the sort of operating system of urban kind of sort of space. So yeah, I think that, I don't know what percentage is, but a large number is in some ways sort of non-architected space. So when you get the opportunity to design something and to sort of really think about that sort of space and that light and that relationship, to materials. It's I think it's a privilege. Obviously, it's a wonderful opportunity to sort of do something. And yeah, I think the majority of clients, I imagine, are still kind of sort of family clients, but there are also obviously corporations, and there is the state itself that is a client. I'm sure everyone would want to be building football stadiums and palaces, but most people, I think, probably don't. They sort of spend their time doing something sort of slightly more domestic and humble. But I think it's still a sort of case of, and you can tell me better than I can sort of tell you, is how you articulate that relationship between the client and the architect. And how when you are sort of talking through space, how you teach each other the language that then is sort of finally articulated in the building itself.
Right. Yeah. I think it would depend upon, who the client is and the building typology as well. I mean, there's, I think, an array of different building types, and then depending upon who you're talking to, yeah, I think you have to understand their motives as well, right? What are they after? And I often say I'm almost a therapist first, and then I'm an architect. And so in a lot of ways, that feels like maybe the right approach to really understand who the client is, what their aspirations are, what they're after, and then maybe attempting to guide them slightly within, let's call it bowling lanes, to not only the most economical solution, the most sustainable solution, or maybe the most socially responsible solution as well. I think that's that may be an outlook or an approach to it that I would call a healthy approach, but it's never going to be perfect, and there's always I think an array of with a building, it's such a static thing, so you're never, in most cases, so you're building something that's in essence frozen in time. It's never going to check all the boxes and satisfy everybody, but maybe you can plan inside of a building in its lifespan to cater to multiple and evolve, to cater to multiple different groups of people, to evolve. It's a very challenging thing to do. I mean, that's a lot of variables to try to address, though.
No, absolutely, and as thinking, going back to that sort of that thought I was having this morning about how many ages or how many lives does the building have, and so it has, before it's built, it has sort of time, space, and then the kind of sort of the design, and then it has the build, and then it has it's lived in, and then it's sort of it's retrofitted in some way. So I live in an early 20th century suburban house in London, and what's true of pretty much every suburban house in London is the wall between the kitchen and the sitting room, where we sort of do our today, has been knocked through because people no longer divide those two spaces up in their day to day, and so that changes the sort of house. That's a whole new life. And then what happens after that? So, but the last life will obviously be kind of sort of when it's a ruin. But it's trying to think. Is there 8 lives? Is there 10 lives? How many times? So, after sort of an architect has sort of handed over the keys, that building has only just been born, and in some ways, sort of it's barely learned language yet.
I think the next half-life of a lot of our homes are going to be where we're sitting in chairs with our VR masks on in the metaverse, experiencing a city digitally. But
I don't think we will. I mean, I think I see a tech lash. I think people are desperate for experiences again.
I completely agree with you. I think that's in an idealistic view. That is really, and I think culturally too. I've seen a little bit of a, let's call it a compass change towards a more kind of humanistic, health-oriented, physical-oriented, interactive mindset change, I think. At least I'd like to think so.
I mean, I think it was going to take us a long time to work out, actually, the true impact of the pandemic and the lockdown. But I do note that, you know, alongside that sort of degradation of public space over a long time, so, you know, over the sort of privatization of public space, I do think that the pandemic really did knock us back in terms of being able to be around other people. And I think we need to sort of come up with reasons to go back to those places. And I think we do actually yearn to be back in large groups, you know, in the public spaces, in the city. We just find it very difficult to find our way back there.
I think it will be, yeah, it'll be a journey back there. But that's amazing, Leo. Thank you for that insight. I thought that was a really insightful conversation. Do you want to add anything, or do you have any items you want to add?
No, I think read Jay Jacobs. I mean,
all right. Well, great. I think we can wrap it up there, Leo. Thank you so much again. I mean, that was very insightful. Your book, like I'd mentioned at the beginning, Phoenix, it was very formative for me personally, and I'm sure many others. Do you want to give us or give the listeners a place where they can contact you at, or name your books?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. I'm on I've got a website which is leohollis.co.uk. That's leohollis.co.uk. And that also has sort of contact details as well. But yeah, I think Twitter. I mean, Instagram as well. I'm all over the social media.
Okay, I'd love to see some of your walks through London. That'd be great.
When you're here, we'll go for a short 4-hour walk.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I better start building my cardio right now, huh? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Leo. Appreciate it.